Good morning. My name is Chris Shigas. I'm a vice president at French West Vaughan, and I specialize in crisis communication and reputation management. I'll tell you, it's an interesting niche that I found myself in, and lots of times dealing with disaster PR, reputation management issues. If a client sees me around a lot, that means things probably aren't going very well. And in fact, I can't tell you how many times I've called a client and they said, "Uh-oh, what's wrong?" I'm going to briefly walk through a couple of high-profile cases that we've worked on, and then talk a little bit about crisis communication planning and how to make sure that you're ready when an event does happen. First of all, this is kind of famous. A lot of people may or may not know this, but in Chinese, the word crisis is in two characters, one for danger and one for opportunity. And as a communications professional or on some sort of crisis emergency response team, it's always important to keep focus on the opportunity that's present in any crisis. So even if you have take for example the high profile national cases of a BP oil spill or Toyota with the brake problem, if you focus on the opportunity there, the opportunity becomes, what can Toyota do to become the safest car in the world, right? Here's a problem that's been researched more than any other car, and there's an opportunity there. You just have to see it and you have to seize it. So a crisis, from a communication professional side, a crisis is an unplanned event with the potential to impact your company or your agency's operability, credibility, pose significant environmental, economic, or legal liability. Working for an agency, we really work with a variety of issues. And lots of times clients will come to us a little late. The crisis already happened, and they're looking for help. Here's two images. One is AstroTurf came to us. A competitor announced that there was lead in the AstroTurf field, the artificial grass. And what was happening around the country is that high schools, elementary schools, college universities were closing off their fields and not letting anybody on the field because of these accusations of lead in the field. Here we had a press conference with a doctor dumping how much AstroTurf a child would have to eat for that lead to reach a dangerous level. The picture on the bottom right, for those of you in North Carolina may remember EQ factory that exploded in Apex, and a toxic cloud kind of hovered over the town and forced the evacuation of tens of thousands of residents. That's another one of those situations where EQ representatives are in front of TV cameras before they even know what they were going to say. Personally, I live in Apex, and my family had to evacuate. I evacuated my family. That Monday morning, my boss pulled me in his office and he says, "Chris, I know you're angry at what happened in Apex, and I know you had to evacuate your family, but," he said, "EQ called us and they need help. And here's the thing, Chris, you don't have to take this on, but I want you to know that how else would you have access to the top executives of that company and get them to do the right thing?" And I took that on as a challenge. And it was a reminder of what I do for a living, is really talking to executives, whether it be in transportation or the corporate world, and how do we talk about doing the right thing. I can tell you through my media trainings, I put them through, there's a section of hostile media training, and I really enjoyed that part, grilling them on everything I was angry about having to move my family. Probably my highest profile current client I've been working with for 3 years is NFL quarterback Michael Vick. And NFL quarterback Michael Vick came to our agency about 3 years ago. He was a third string quarterback. He had no marketing deals. He was on a 1-year contract with the Philadelphia Eagles. And he came, we had a conversation, and he said, "I want to do the right thing." He said, look, I have all these charity offers coming in from all over. I'm trying to, play this football thing, and I don't know what to do. I don't know how to do the right thing. I want to do it. I want to be proactive in what I do. I just need someone to help me through this process. At which point I told him, we're not a spin doctor. I'm not just going to twist words around to make you look good. You have to want to do the work. You have to want to earn people's trust again. From that time, he said that's what he wants to do. During the season, Mike gets 1 day off a week. Used to be, when he was in Atlanta, he would spend that 1 day off a week doing illegal activity. And once he got to Philadelphia, he decided he was going to change. And he spent that 1 day off per week doing charity work, and to the point where the Philadelphia Eagles had to call me and say, nobody does this much charity work. I would venture to say that Mike does the most community work than any other NFL football player, and he should. And he should. He knows it's a privilege to be where he is and to get a second chance like he has. But the reality is that he wants to do the right thing, and that's why he's there. Some quick things about this program for Mike is that to make sure that he succeeds, we wanted to put him in places that make sense, where he can make a real difference in his community. These kids listen to every word he has to say. When we go to a depressed area in North Philly and we talk about the dangers of why dogfighting is a dead-end street, these kids are sitting on the edge of their seat listening to every word he has to say. I have teachers come up to me and say, you know what? There were 1,000 teachable moments in what he had to say. And since that time that he's been doing the right thing, he changed his life around and he started doing the right thing. We were at a charity event when Coach Reed called him and said, Mike, I'm going to make you the starter of the Philadelphia Eagles. Since that time, he was able to land a long-term contract with the Philadelphia Eagles. His marketing endorsements came back. Even Nike, for the first time ever, re-signed an athlete that they had fired previously. So Mike continues. He's got his marketing deals. He has his football money. He's emerging from bankruptcy. He's off probation. And he's still doing a very active community relations campaign. And in fact, just last week, the Michael Vick Team Vick Foundation donated $200,000 to a field in a depressed area in Philadelphia. And that football field is going to be named Team Vick Field. And it's giving the kids in that community a place to play football. Probably the most emotional crisis I had to deal with was at a nursing home in North Carolina, in a small community called Carthage, North Carolina, where 9 people were shot inside the nursing home facility. The unusual part about this process is when I arrived about 2 hours after the shooting, it was still a crime scene, but they were still operating within the facility. There were still residents that needed to be taken care of within this nursing home. And so as I ducked under the crime tape and I walked into the office, and there was a group of employees saying the Lord's Prayer. And as I turned around the corner, the CEO of the nursing home had his head in his hands, and he looked up to me and he said, I'm so glad you're here. And so when a crisis hits, it can pluck you from anonymity. And before you know it, Good Morning America is leaving messages on your cell phone, and there's satellite trucks parked in your front yard, and all sorts of, Anderson Cooper wants an interview, and Fox News wants an interview. And it can be overwhelming. And I can tell you, in these emergency crisis situations, these CEOs keep me closer to them than they do their attorneys. Because it's that their reputation is more important then that's their name is all they have. Their name is all they have. So a couple quick things. I want you to know that one thing when you're in a crisis to remember is that crises are about victims. They're not about things. They're not about buildings. They're not about roads. They're not about bridges. They're about victims. They're about people. They're about people, and it's important to keep that in mind. And also, it's not about you. All right, no matter how you feel, it was a famous quote from the BP CEO said, I just want my life back. right? Everybody remember that? Fail. He didn't make it about the victims, did he? He made it about himself. All right, so some important elements of crisis planning. Why do we do it? We want to prepare leadership to respond. We want to help staff be unified and consistent in how they proceed. We want to enhance and protect the organization's reputation. And we want to manage critical sensitive information to employees, clients, the media, and the public, key stakeholders, elected officials. So before a crisis, we want to make sure we engage in proactive community relations. Be doing the right thing already. We call it at French West Vaughan, we call it a trust bank. Are you making deposits in your trust bank right now? Because at someday you may have to make a withdrawal. Will that be there? Will that credibility, will that trust be there when you need to make that withdrawal? Also create a crisis communication plan. How many of you all have active crisis communication plans? All right, that's good. Elements of a good crisis communication plan, a quick start guide, so when you're in an emergency, you know some steps of what to do. You want to establish your CERT. A CERT is a crisis emergency response team. Who's going to be on that team? Who's going to be in the war room making decisions when there's an emergency? You want to establish your agency's crisis policies. Come up with some crisis scenarios. What are some likely things to happen, and how would you respond to them? Write some sample press releases. Write some sample statements to the media. Who will be the spokesperson? Who's going to talk? Those kinds of things. And keep media and your key stakeholder contact information up to date within the crisis plan. The crisis emergency response team should look something like this. You want your executive director or CEO, CFO, and I'm not sure what the equivalent is in transportation, but you want somebody who has access to money quickly. In order to do the right thing, you may need to do some things quickly. Things like fly the victims' families in, all right? It's not an expense that you have to do, but you know what? If it's the right thing to do, then do it. You want the communication director and whoever the spokesperson's going to be for the crisis, your legal counsel. An SME is a subject matter expert, so if you have a problem with a bridge, you want an expert on bridges within your CERT. And any standby resources. Do you need the IT guy there? Because you got to get quick updates to your webpage, those kinds of things. Priorities, limit the problem. Communicate with those most directly affected, the victims and their families. And I'll tell you, this is important, that you need to reach out to these victims and their families. They're going to be the first ones to do a ton of damage to you in the media too. And you need to make sure that they're okay. That CEO for the nursing home, I made him call every family for the victims. And it was the hardest thing he ever had to do. And they yelled at him. And they wondered why he didn't protect their loved ones. But it was the right thing to do. It was definitely the right thing to do. At least, even if they yelled at him and expressed their anger towards him, at least they knew that he had the decency to call. You want to communicate internally with your employees and staff. Don't forget about all those people internally who need to know what's going on. Communicate with indirectly affected, government officials, people who have key stakeholders, and communicate with the news media. Now notice I put communicate with the news media last. All right, this is an order of priority. It's not first, it's last. Here's an important principle. People who feel they are not being heard, speak louder. You know, if someone calls your department and they have a complaint and they feel like they haven't gotten anywhere, then they write a letter to the editor. And if they feel like the letter to the editor didn't get them anywhere, then they picket. And if they feel like picketing didn't get them anywhere, then they sue. So it's important as communication professionals that you make sure that no matter how ridiculous you think the complaint is, that you make sure that person feels as if they've been heard. Repeat it back to them. In a statement to the media, we want to express sympathy and concern for the victims and their families. We want to communicate your action steps of what you plan to do and express full cooperation with any authorities of the investigation. And this is important. People are very forgiving in America. They just want to know what decisions you made when you knew it. And if you start doing the right thing, then they're very forgiving about the incident that happened in the first place. They just want to make sure that once you knew there was a problem, you were taking corrective action for the problem. When you have when you're speaking to the media, it's important that you have an agenda of what you want to say, talking points. You want a key message and supporting messages. Right here in this message triangle, this is an opportunity to write down 4 key messages that you want to communicate in an interview. I will tell you that you cannot communicate more than that. If you try to communicate more than that, you're saying too much and you won't get anything at all. You want to make sure that you stay on your agenda, and then you know if the reporter's questions are bringing you off of that key message triangle, you know that that's a red flag. You need to get it back onto the things that you need to communicate. So after a crisis, you want to secure the loose ends. You want a recognition of heroes in the crisis. You do a media coverage assessment. How did we do? What was the tonality? Do a crisis communication review on how you handled the emergency, and update your communication plan accordingly based on the new information that you have and the experience that you just learned. So thank you for your time this morning. I just want to leave you with my guiding principle when I talk to corporations who are in crisis is do the right thing. And when we have a question comes up, do we do this? Do we not do this? How do we act? How do we behave? How do we move forward? If we let this be our guiding principle, it will not steer you wrong. Okay, thank you.
I do not, you're just going to have to listen to me for a little bit because I don't have a PowerPoint. And let me also, yes, thank you. I gave, we had a Board of Trustees meeting this past weekend and I gave 5 presentations and I thought, you know, if I have to show one more New Yorker cartoon up there, I just might explode. What I'd like to talk about are I'm not going to talk so much about the nuts and bolts because I think Chris did an excellent job of walking through a plan that everybody should have if they don't have it already. But what I do want to do is talk about some cliches of crisis communications and crisis management. In fact, 7 cliches of crisis communications and crisis management that I have gleaned. I have a lot more cliches, actually. The cliches are very helpful when you're a spokesperson, as you know. Every issue is a very complex issue that's going to take a while to figure out, and we're going to do the right thing. But these are some cliches that have come about from I guess 25 years of crisis management of some kind or another, starting in the foreign policy world and then moving into public broadcasting, where I spent 5 years, and then on to two great universities, where people tend to think of universities as kind of the little red schoolhouse with happy students and even happier faculty members who are out there doing interesting things. But in fact, universities, not unlike transportation departments, are enormously complex, chaotic places. And the 2 that I've been fortunate to be associated with have had at their heart pretty much every part of the human experience from birth to death happening on our campus every day. So a normal day might involve everything from a shooting to an arrest to a medical malpractice issue to something happening with an athlete to a natural disaster to a political issue. I mean, you name it, across the board, we have it. And I think one thing that it has sensitized me is the fact that in real crises, people die. And having to deal, as you all do, having to deal with the ultimate kinds of tragedies, it tends to put a lot of things in perspective. So let me talk about some cliches about crisis management and crisis communications. Starting with, this is a crisis. A mentor of mine once told me a long time ago that if everything is a crisis, then nothing is a crisis. And as in the role that you're in as communications professionals and communications executives at agencies, one of the things that you can do, certainly one of the things that I have found valuable in my role and with my colleagues, is to help people understand that not everything is a crisis. So I just to test this out, I looked at this morning when I got up, I did a search on the last 24 hours of the New York Times to see how many times a crisis was identified. And I found 28 crises in the New York Times. Let me give you some of the examples. The sovereign debt crisis, the Syrian refugee crisis, the mortgage crisis, the financial crisis, the alcohol health crisis, the European economic crisis, the Yemeni food crisis, the Japanese power crisis, on the history page, the Little Rock desegregation crisis and the Tylenol crisis. There's the Port Clyde fisheries crisis. Go back to the paper and you can look that one out. The Cuban Missile Crisis, because we're coming up on another anniversary. And my favorite in this morning's New York Times, the Eddie Murphy Oscar show crisis. So if there's one thing that as communications professionals we can do, it is to help people understand that there are controversies, there are issues that we have to manage. If we treat every crisis like a crisis, again, then nothing is a crisis. Second cliche, we have to get ahead of this story, whatever it is. We have to get ahead of this story. Now, I worked in Washington for 12 years, and that is certainly a mantra, and that was, I think, a very relevant kind of cliche at a time when, if you wanted to know what was in the next day's Washington Post, as I frequently wanted to do, you went out to 1150 15th Street at 11 o'clock at night when somebody brought out a stack of newspapers, put them on the sidewalk, and everybody from the PR firms and the Hill and the political campaigns and the agencies would grab a paper so you can see what was in the Post the next day, and you do the whole thing again 24 hours later. Today, the idea of getting ahead of a story is valid in certain respects, but is increasingly a quaint artifact of the digital age, an age in which if you know it, chances are, by the time you know it, chances are a whole lot of other people have known it as well. And that is especially true in the business in the very public business that you're in, where there are people and roads and projects and trains and bridges and everything else. There's a very good chance that that something that you're learning is already on YouTube, is already been posted on Facebook, has already been emailed around. We had talk about transportation last year. We have an extensive campus bus system, and last year we had the misfortune of 2 buses spontaneously catching on fire, not at the same time. Nobody was hurt. It was perfectly. It was all fine. They were old buses, and they both spontaneously combusted. The first one I found out about when my daughter, who was in high school, called me or texted me because it had just been posted to Facebook that with a picture of somebody who was on the bus. So within 10 seconds of that bus bursting on fire, one of the students who was on the bus took a picture, posted it to Facebook, and we had our online bus fire. So getting ahead of the story can work in certain circumstances, but understand, I think we all understand that increasingly and inevitably we are managing crisis and crisis communications in real time as it's happening. Third cliche. This will hold. Don't worry about it. Nobody's going to find out about it. We can hold this until we're ready to act on it. I hear some chuckles in the audience. Enough said about that. Fourth cliche: we need to wait until we get all the facts before we say something. Now that is in fact a valid. That is in fact a valid and useful cliche. We do need to get all the facts before we say something. But even saying we need to get all the facts before we say something is better than saying nothing. The expectations and the demands, as Chris said, the expectations and demands on institutions to be visible, to be active, and to, if nothing else, indicate that you care and concern are enormous. So saying something, even as anodyne as we need to get all the facts before we can say something, is better than saying nothing. Next cliche: we can fix this. Well, you might be able to fix it, but defining what fixing is a very important part of the communication directors and the communications executives' role. Once something has happened, it can't unhappen. It's not going to be forgotten. A diversion will oftentimes, especially in the very public sphere in which you operate, a diversion will often be seen for what it is, a diversion. So being forthright in acknowledging that situations do exist, creating messages and other things and other kinds of content that will help put things in context and perspective is a very valuable part of managing crisis and controversy. Now, it's obviously very difficult and maybe even somewhat distasteful, or very distasteful, to put a disaster in which lives have been lost and property has been damaged in perspective. But many of the things that you work on, that your colleagues and that your bosses will identify in crises, are actually not those kind of life-threatening, property-threatening issues. They tend to be more on the political side and on the micro side as opposed to the macro side. One of my favorites, it'll all be okay, we'll prepare a holding statement, and that'll work. Because we know something's going to happen in 2 weeks, so we'll prepare a holding statement that will actually absolutely be valid for all the questions we're going to get asked. Lawyers love holding statements. The CFOs love holding statements because they sometimes tend to think that an issue or the way an issue is going to be presented or portrayed can be frozen in time, and that we can predict today what's going to happen and how something is going to be covered in 2 weeks. So the next time somebody says holding statement, I would suggest thinking of it as first draft, and we'll see what happens. And then finally, the battle cry of the crisis management room: we're toast. This is it. It is the end of the world. And having been through, and I think Chris would probably attest to, I would hope attest to this as well, what seems like an all-consuming fire when you're in the middle of an all-consuming fire, guess what, is not going to be an all-consuming fire. We've talked about companies like Tylenol and Toyota and BP. Who remembers the great Apple bumper crisis with the iPhone 4, right? Okay, 1, 2 people. This. If you go back and look at the crisis that people couldn't make phone calls on their iPhone 4 and how this was going to tank Apple stock, you will find, and the company, and that was it, the iPhone was history, you will find time and again premature predictions of corporate, institutional, and political death based on issues and situations that at the time may have been all-consuming. At the time may have been people who may have had a whole lot of people around it who were invested in keeping those fans flamed, but in reality are normal, expected, unfortunate, but manageable bumps in the road on the way to resolution. So, without minimizing the impact of all of that, I would say one of the very important things that we as communications executives who have a finger on the pulse of public opinion, internal and external, have to do and must add is perspective to institutions and organizations that have been around a long time, that are going to be around a long time, and that have an obligation to serving the public and to maintaining the public trust at a time and maintaining a cool head at a time when many others are not inclined to do that. So 7 cliches for crisis communications and crisis management. I thank you for the opportunity to talk about them, and I look forward to our questions.
I unfortunately have a PowerPoint slide. As a college professor, as part of your contract, I can't go to the bathroom without a PowerPoint slide, but I'll try to be brief with it. I thank my colleagues for stating some really important things that I'll probably make reference to in the course of my few minutes with you. But I study political leaders who get in trouble. And fortunately, there's a wealth of things to study out there. But let me tell you a little story. I was a 23-year-old political neophyte when I was living in the state of Texas. I was a campaign manager for a woman who was running for the State House of Texas. And I committed the cardinal sin of campaign managers, which is to not thoroughly investigate your own candidate before you go out on the campaign trail with that candidate. And I discovered one morning that my candidate had not paid property taxes for 3 years. The good news is I discovered this before the news media discovered this and before the opponent discovered this. And Michael is right in that not everything is a crisis, but when you're working for a political candidate and you find out something like that, that's a crisis. So in my little world, it was a crisis, and I needed to know how to deal with it. Well, I also used Chris's advice, which is do the right thing. I said to my candidate, you're going to be at the tax office when it opens this morning with a check in hand, even if you have to ask your mother for the money, and you're going to pay your property taxes. And we're going to go from there. Well, I learned a pretty important lesson at that point, both about the research and also about how to manage a crisis. But what I want to talk to you about today is some really simple things I've learned, not only from my political work, but also my research. And it really goes back to do the right thing. Because sometimes in the world of politics, you all work for politicians when you work for your secretary. Even transportation secretaries get into trouble sometimes, not just governors, presidential candidates, and others. And just simply using that kind of advice your mother taught you at the age of 7 or 8, which is just to fess up, will carry you a long way in terms of dealing with that issue. So I'm kind of going to give you some practical advice and kind of talk through just some basic issues. Now in North Carolina, we've had just a wealth of politicians who have committed all kinds of bad acts and bad statements. We've had a Secretary of Agriculture who had to resign because of a campaign finance issue. We most recently had the Vice President of Institutional Advancement at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill have to resign. We've had a governor who is the first governor in the state of North Carolina to be convicted. And we've had a state representative who's had to resign from the state house. But that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the kind of issues you face. Sometimes it's a crime that's committed, sometimes it's a scandal that has been ongoing or just committed, sometimes it's just a stupid statement that is made. But my point is that, you know, there are ways to deal with these issues even if you don't protect ultimately that politician's political career. There's still things you can do. Well, we all know that politicians, and I'm just going to use a statement from Sarah Palin. Sarah Palin, I'm not going to pick on one party or the other, but Sarah Palin made a statement that she ultimately ended up regretting in 2008. You might remember this from 4 years ago during the presidential campaign. And she was talking about real America. Well, that got a lot of news coverage, and the McCain folks said, you know, Sarah, you really ought to talk about this and come up with something better to say. And then she did what most politicians are wont to do, which is to say, if that's the way it came across, I apologize. And so, as your mother would have told you at the age of 7 or 8, if you can't make a sincere apology, don't make it at all. And we see sometimes people in administrative jobs and political jobs, candidates, they sound often like that insincere professional athlete or someone else, celebrity, who says, well, if I offended anyone, I'm sorry. If I offended anyone. If you have to make statements like that, you're not doing a good job at reputation management. But my own work is that there are recurrent themes and recurrent patterns of communicative behavior to deal with reputation issues. So I write about this all the time, studying politicians. We have this need because our reputation in politics is our most valuable commodity. If you don't have reputation, you're not going to have a political future. But if we remember some of the famous examples from the last 15 years, and I'm just going to briefly make reference to this because most of you probably remember these cases. If you remember Bill Clinton in the Monica Lewinsky case, what's the first thing he did when the scandal exploded. I did not have sex with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. All right, now, all of you are communication professionals. Would you have advised President Clinton to say that? Of course not. That just came across wrong in so many different ways. Well, finally, once sanity hit, and once his political reputation was really suffering and he was going to be impeached, he went on television and did a totally different kind of apology. And if you remember the 60 Minutes interview in which he and Hillary were there and tearfully talked about the damage to his family and what he had done, well, you started to see his approval ratings rise. So we remember examples like that. The first impulse is usually the wrong one. Ultimately, some politicians get it right, some don't. I have another couple of examples that I'll just mention to you, but there are a lot of strategies. We know denial is a strategy. Denial in the world of politics usually means where there's smoke, there's fire. And so denial is not a responsibility. Shifting the blame, I was entrapped. We know many politicians who say that. Evading a responsibility is another major strategy that politicians use. It doesn't simply work. Evading of responsibility, there are many techniques you can use to sort of push aside the responsibility. You can talk about your corrective behavior. I'm going to do better next time. Or even, I may have done wrong, but I'm really going to go out and help people. Now, sometimes this works in the world of politics. Michael Vick's example is a great example that Chris tells us about some of this compensation idea. He worked for charities and has been the spokesperson against animal cruelty. Well, given his circumstance, that makes a lot of sense. So he's done right, even in the communities where he had done wrong. And then finally, the one that really does work most often with politicians is to actually what's called mortification. This idea, take responsibility and ask for forgiveness. We've heard from our previous presenters, we are a very forgiving culture. And oftentimes when politicians say or do things that cause reputational problems, simply saying, I'm sorry, I really ask for your forgiveness, or I have changed really works. Again, just to remind you, I'll not talk about this example, but Trent Lott did everything wrong. If you remember Trent Lott, he made a statement about Strom Thurmond on Strom Thurmond's birthday that was considered by many to be a racist statement. Well, he tried 7 different times to apologize. He was a serial apologist. And ultimately, you know what happened to Trent Lott. He did all the usual things. He said it didn't happen. He said if it did happen, he was misconstrued. And he did the thing that politicians should never, ever do. Blame the media. That it was the media's fault. Well, just think about Trent Lott back in '96 and how similar it was to Herman Cain, the Republican candidate for the Republican nomination for president, when he started having all his reputation issues. Went through the exact same issues as Trent Lott did. Ultimately, had to get out of the race. So again, there are many techniques that don't work. Richard Nixon sort of came back from the dead so many times in terms of his reputational issues. The Chequers speech, which I reference here, is just a great example of what kind of work I do in terms of studying how politicians can talk about their own circumstances within a larger cultural narrative. But here's the lessons I've learned from both my practical work and working for politicians who've made all kinds of dumb blunders, as well as studying them academically. You've got to be immediate. Your mother would say, when you hurt your friend Billy, go immediately and apologize. It works the same in politics. As we've heard from my fellow panelists, the more you sit on something, the worse you're going to be. You must construct the apology around the narrative, around the story that fits the cultural narrative of the time. Bill Clinton, his story in the final apology on 60 Minutes, he told a story that fit the 1990s. It fit the apology story of the 90s. In the 70s, in the 80s, in the 2000s, there are different narratives or different stories that are part of our own cultural milieu. And what the politician needs to do is tell the story in a way that makes sense to the people. You must relate to your audience. Bill Clinton related to the audience at that time. He talked to us as people, not a president, not a constitutional lawyer and a constitutional law professor. People who get out of trouble politically, they show emotion, the appropriate emotion. Sometimes tears are not called for. Tears can backfire. Sometimes they are, but it's the appropriate emotion. And really, and this is a lesson I think to you as much as you can, to keep the legal department out of it. That if your first impulse is to run it by legal affairs, if your secretary is in trouble, what's the primary responsibility of the legal affairs department?
Say nothing.
Keep you out of litigation, right? And so when I worked on a statewide campaign in Texas and my political leader made some really bad statements and had some inappropriate behaviors, the first thing the attorneys on the campaign wanted to do was, let's do exactly what Bill Clinton did in 1998, that famous interview in which he parsed the word is. It depends on what the word is. Remember that statement? That was him thinking like a lawyer. He was trying to get out of the legal mess that he may have constructed around the perjury. He wasn't thinking like a real politician talking to real people. So as much as you can, try to keep the legal department out of it. I know that's impossible in most of our jobs, but if you can just remember the words of your mother when you were 7, just apologize. Thank you very much.
We have a few minutes for questions. If you all have some questions you'd like to ask of our panelists. Yes, sir.
How do you argue with the attorneys who almost always win the year of the director?
Well, excuse me, I'll take that on because I've worked with lots of attorneys. There are attorneys you can argue with. I have found, and maybe I've just been fortunate, that the attorneys are among the people that you should keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Keep your attorney as close as possible to you. Paradoxically, build a strong relationship with your general counsel. There are a few people that, and working with the federal government, at the beginning of my career, I got some good advice on this. There are a few people that you want to absolutely have know you and as your friends. The person who sits outside the CEO or the secretary or the director's door, the head of personnel, the head of security, because they know all the secrets, and the general counsel. Maybe that's a bit Pollyanna-ish, but if your relationship with your counsel starts out hostile and antagonistic, it's probably going to stay that way. So I would encourage you to double down and do whatever you can to make that a positive and productive and trusting relationship. Because when it is, and when it works well, it's like the clouds open up and a lot of things become possible when dealing with communications issues.
I'll just add one thing to that. One thing that I've found that works with legal DOT is that I often craft the message I want it to be and then say, here's what I think, and then they come back, and because we do have the relationship you described, then you can come back and say, well, is it okay if we try this? Can you move in this direction? But if I start with something, my experience is if I start with something on paper, it's easier to get them closer to where I want to be.
And you also want your counsel to have enough trust in you that you're brought in again, another cliche. If you want us there for the crash landing, then make sure we're there for the takeoff. You want your counsel to be in a position where he or she will bring you in at the takeoff because you know there's going to be a crash landing somewhere.
Gerald?
Yeah, I just wanted to first of all thank you all for 3 clear messages that came out to me, and that was integrity, honesty, and trust. I think it's really refreshing to hear that those are the foundations for what we need to be doing. But a thought occurred to me. Most of the time our crises end up being played out in the media, which is not an environment of integrity. Oftentimes it's kind of if it bleeds, it leads kind of a thing. I'm sure you've all heard that, and I've even heard that our challenges against deep
I guess I can take that on. Well, I think you have to evaluate how you approach the media, not as a confrontational situation, but more as an asset to them. And understand, I can't tell you how many times, Michael Vick is interviewed every day by dozens of journalists, and just like a politician, lots of the questions are framed in the negative, and you have to turn that around to the positive. And my reminder is, they're just questions. The questions don't do the damage, the answers do. And it's their job to ask questions. So if you come in with that understanding, from a communication professional, it's always good to be a resource to them. Interviews themselves are for sound bites. Behind the scenes, you can give them fact sheets, Q&As, press releases, all those other things. Interviews are for sound bites. And so if you approach it where you're working hard to be helpful to the media, that if you really feel that there's an unfairness about the coverage and you can identify some of the things that are unfair, there are steps you can take within a news organization to identify inaccuracy. One thing I would also recommend, though, if it's a very antagonistic relationship and you're putting your client or your boss in jeopardy, don't circle the wagons to the point that you forget that there's an outside world there. In the case of the nursing home, we didn't have the CEO speak to the media, but the association president did, an association of nursing homes, who could talk about best practices that nursing homes follow and what the case was here. So you also have access to associations and things who can speak on behalf of the transportation industry.